Welcome to the Green Issues Forum, a series of programs sponsored by the Green Party of South Puget Sound. I'm Janet Jordan, and I have here with me today three citizens who are active in the community and extremely knowledgeable about water issues: Bev Bassett, Helen Wheatley, and Harry Branch. And today we are going to talk about a proposal for a building to be built at the southern end of Bud Inlet, in fact, actually in the historical estuary, Moxlie Creek.
Moxlie and Indian are both now in the culvert that runs into East Bay, just adjacent to this property. This property that we're concerned about is owned by the Port of Olympia. They propose developing it with a huge residential, retail, and parking building, 5 stories high, 250 feet long, fronting on State Street. And to develop on this undeveloped land will forever forbid us restoring this land into estuary. Estuary is that wonderful saltwater, freshwater interface where so much life is nurtured and begins. And by developing it, we forever lose the opportunity to restore some semblance of normal function to our ecosystems at East Bay.
Thank you. So we need to talk about why we might be critical of this decision to let Westman Mill go forward. The decision hasn't quite been made, but the process is moving forward smoothly, I would say. Why is it important not to build on an estuary? Can you help us, Harry?
Estuaries are an important mixing zone there where freshwater and nutrients coming from land meet the saltwater environment, and being lighter than saltwater, the freshwater and nutrients will flow out on the surface, and this will tend to draw saltwater and other organisms in underneath. So ideally you have a lot of phytoplankton that will consume the nutrients on the surface, and you have zooplankton coming in underneath that will control the abundance of phytoplankton, and you have a continual balance. And this all happens best in the presence of abundant sunlight and atmospheric oxygen. So really, in an ecological sense, tide flats are one of nature's perfect designs. Additionally, as a channel narrows, liquids will flow faster, and as the channel widens, it's just basic hydrology that then the flow rate will reduce. That's another reason why you want broad tide flats, because otherwise the flow of water will be so swift that it would cause scouring and you won't have sedimentation. So the idea that we could restore or daylight a small portion of this stream next to this construction and have any semblance of an estuary it just is not reasonable. You'd have to have it heavily armored, probably with concrete, because of the swift flow of current through there. So there would be no biota, there would be no salt marsh.
So
no,
you have a lot of microorganisms arriving at the end of this pipe, but they're going to be...
What you have at the end of the pipe is a lot of nutrients. There's a study done by the EPA that nitrates travel 18 times farther in a pipe that's in the ground, that's in a darkened pipe, than one that would be seeing daylight, than a stream that sees daylight. And that's because, again, phytoplankton in the freshwater environment are consuming the nitrogen and bringing it into the food chain. It's not only that you're remediating nitrates and nutrients and controlling algae and, you know, creating healthy water quality. This is where the web of life begins. So when we see that salmon and orca don't have enough to eat, look to the base of the food web to figure out why. And, you know, it all begins with phytoplankton. You can read over 1,000 pages of documents on this proposal, and at least I have not seen the word phytoplankton anywhere. So we're not doing any oceanography. And that's, if we did any oceanography, we would recognize the importance of a real estuary, of having as close as you can to a proper structure. Running it through a long pipe like this, all you get is bacteria incubation.
Okay, you get a lot of corpses of microorganisms, plus the bacteria that are feeding on them.
And you get an overproliferation of algae because you don't have a web of life, basically, and you get blooms and die-offs and then dead zones, and it all pertains to basic oceanographic principles, physical, chemical, and biological parameters.
Could I take a step back and bring us to Moxlie Creek a little bit so that
Sure.
we can sort of visualize this? Because why does this matter with this particular parcel of land? And this is a really important question, and there are a couple of dimensions to it, I think, that both go to the fact that what it should be is an area that that feeds life in the ocean. And one of the points is that when Indian and Moxlie Creek flowed freely in this area, you saw a lot of salmon types. And even in the 1990s, when studies were done of Indian Creek, I have a list here of the salmonids that they found and that live in Indian Creek and also in Moxlie Creek to some degree. Chum, sea run cutthroat, coho salmon, Chinook salmon, and steelhead. They all migrate up the pipe into Indian Creek and into Moxlie Creek. So we're talking about salmon that, despite all odds for a century, and despite slow strangulation or starvation, or both, from lack of oxygen and from lack of food, are managing, and from toxins coming in, they still manage to swim up that pipe and make it to areas of Indian and Moxlie Creek, where some effort has been made to try to restore habitat. But what is the point of trying to restore habitat upstream if they have to travel through this death zone or this gauntlet in order to get there? So from the point of view of thinking about the lives of salmon, and salmon being representative of the ecosystem as a whole, that is why we care so deeply about the restoration of Moxlie Creek and the daylighting of Moxlie Creek. So that's one dimension. Now, the other thing that you were touching on with talking about algae blooms is that the other thing about the East Bay, where Moxlie Creek pipe flows, is that under federal clean water law, it is the most polluted part of Bud Inlet and the Deschutes watershed, because even though it's part of the Moxlie Creek, Indian Creek watershed, it's also part of the larger Deschutes watershed.
Okay.
So if you look at those little triangles on the right side of that picture at the very bottom where it says Olympia, that would be the East Bay. And that is an area that has been so polluted as not only from legacy pollutants from things like dioxins, but also from the lack of oxygen due to the lack of flow, that it has triggered the federal Clean Water Law, and it did that back when the law was passed, and in all these ensuing years, we have yet to come up with a plan to clean it up. And one of the reasons for that is that if you want to solve the problem of low dissolved oxygen that feeds critters in the water, you have to improve circulation, which is what Harry was also talking about. And in order to do that, you need to allow all the water to flow into Bud Inlet, not only Moxlie and Indian Creek and the other surrounding small streams, but also you have to take out the dam, because what happens is the circulation is too weak to be able to help the water flow.
If you look at the estuary of Moxlie and Indian Creek, it's almost as significant as the river estuary. So if we're going to talk about getting rid of the dam and restoring the Deschutes estuary, we have to include East Bay. It was a part of the estuary.
At the top, you see the Deschutes River coming down, and the Fifth Avenue Dam is not there yet. This is what we had when things were healthier, when we had fish and birds. We no longer, I don't even see seagulls much downtown anymore.
Right, and I'm thinking a lot of people didn't even know there was a creek there. So here are some pictures. This is the exit on State Street. Okay,
Yeah.
Olympia Avenue. And then Chestnut would be the one that it runs along beside. And it goes underground right at the intersection of Union and Plum. This shows going up to that intersection, and it shows where Indian Creek joins Moxlie Creek before it goes underground. And going further to the east, you can see how Moxlie Creek comes from Watershed Park, whereas Indian Creek comes from much further north, the Olympia Woodland Trail area.
Right, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about that Moxlie Creek pipe, is that it is actually piping for two watersheds, because the Indian Creek watershed is about the Indian Creek is about 3 miles long, and it's the better habitat, and what it does is it flows into the Moxlie Creek watershed and joins with that watershed. And a lot of people have the mistaken idea, and they'll say, well, you know, not that many salmon go up there. Moxlie Creek, if you go into Watershed Park, there's a lot of silt there. It's not a good breeding place for salmon, so what's the fuss? But the reality is, what is the greater concern is that many more types of salmonids and many more salmon are actually going up Indian Creek, which is about 3 miles, compared to Moxlie Creek, which is about 1 mile as a watershed. And so you can't really talk about the Moxlie Creek pipe without talking about the importance of Indian Creek as well as Moxlie Creek as it runs up into Watershed Park. Okay. So that's a very common sort of assumption or misunderstanding that a lot of people have about this pipe.
Okay. The grate where it goes underground, at this point, Indian and Moxlie Creek join together, go underground.
And inglorious for our important water supply.
What the creek actually looks like in its native habitat up in Watershed Park.
Well, before that, actually, one thing I would like to mention about this very spot in this picture is that this is the area where, even historically in the 20th century, the water that was flowing was relatively clean water. But once it went underground and into this piping system, it became not only creek water, but it became a combination of creek water, stormwater runoff, and sewage back in the
Are
old
you
days.
saying-
Even this area that you're seeing in this picture is nowadays it's engineered. You know, they actually did some work on this area when they put this in. But what I'm saying is that where it becomes a culvert, where it was turned into a culvert in the 20th century, when they did that, they not only were moving the streams underground, but they were creating a sewer system. That was the main thing they were interested in, was turning it into a sewer system and a stormwater system. Now, historically, I have to say that when the city of Olympia came in, Moxlie Creek was pretty much treated as the city sewer anyway, when it was an open stream. And just like a lot of other features, I think sometimes people develop an opinion of an estuary that's based on their direct experience of it after it's been turned into a sewer or as a recipient of waste of any kind. And then they'll say it's ugly, it's smelly, it's a bog, whatever.
done that
But the
with
problem
Capitol
was,
Lake.
yeah, exactly. But the problem was that the Moxlie Creek estuary was turned into the city sewer when
Does
they
sewage
developed the
still
real
go
estate.
into it? I don't think so.
No, now it's still a stormwater pipe though. But no, when they changed the sewer system, but when they built this, it was the first major trunk line sewer system in the city. And so it was this concept
poor
of
old Moxlie
combining the three.
I know.
Right.
Isn't that a sad irony that it starts out in Watershed Park, and by the time it enters Puget Sound in East Bay, it is loaded with really deadly toxins to the point that no birds and fish can really survive in this water. It picks up toxins from places that we don't understand. We don't know what the sources of those toxins are because it's inadequately studied.
So we are working around to the idea that it's not a good idea to have Moxlie Creek run through a long pipe. Are there any other reasons we can think of why it might not be such a great idea?
Well, maybe this would be a good place to talk about wetlands as part of the answer
Sure.
to that question. Do you want to talk about that, Bev? A little bit about the wetland situation on that property?
Here's a picture.
We had, before the Port of Olympia cleaned up the property, the top foot of it or so, and put down rock, there was an artesian spring which was obviously present on this piece of property, and cattails grew up over a period of a year or so, and the birds and the wildlife began to use it. The frogs came and croaked, and there were people who took notice and enjoyed the presence of this little bit of nature and natural ecological processes right downtown. Whenever they cleaned the property up, they took that artesian spring and routed it into a storm drain and covered all of the cattails and everything with rock and got rid of them.
In fact, that's the
Effectively.
area where they're putting the building, I believe. Is it
Oh,
not?
it's,
Or planning to put the building, I should say.
The other issue that goes on here, involves contamination, dioxin and PCB contamination, and the source of a lot of that is probably Cascade Pole, and that was a kind of a complicated development too. Cascade Pole was a company that treated pilings and other poles out on the end of the Port Peninsula with creosote, and it caused a lot of contamination to just fall on the ground the way it was done, and it poured into the offshore sediments and poured across the peninsula, some of it into the main part of Butt Inlet. What happened is, let's just take Cascade Pole. I think that was the predominant source of the problem. And the reason for that is not just the quantity of dioxin, but that the dioxin is mixed with other oily substances in creosote. So the port claims that it's not a problem at this development site that we find dioxin in the subsurface soil, because dioxin isn't mobilized, it doesn't move. That isn't true if the dioxin has met up with any kind of oily substance, because it adheres, it mixes with oil. And so that's what's happened in Butt Inlet, and that's why creosote is so bad, is that the dioxin is mobilized, and it exists largely throughout the bay. And back to, what are the possible sources? When we cleaned up the Cascade Pole site, one of the problems was that in order to keep the company in the loop as a responsible party, the cleanup was only considered to the property line going onto the peninsula, whereas the contamination extended further south. So after the remediation, we discovered, yes, there's a lot of contamination still there. The port built a slurry wall around that entire section of the log yard. And slurry it's what you thicken Chinese food with. It's cornstarch and water, or in this case, probably bentonite clay or something. But it doesn't work in intertidal zones, and we know that from established protocol, and yet it was attempted here anyway, and of course didn't work. The tide goes up and down throughout the peninsula. So you have that source. It's coming probably from throughout the peninsula, from land that wasn't cleaned up in the first place. Then you have sediments prior to the Cascade Pole site being recognized as a Superfund site. You had sediments that were dredged for navigation purposes from that area of contamination, and that was used as fill in various places, mostly on the Port Peninsula. We're not sure where that fill went, and we could assume that it's a likely source, and yet we're proceeding with development. So the whole idea of cleaning up as you go, only really being concerned about the exposure of the public. So we put down netting, we do a real surface cleanup and put down some crushed rock, protect the public, but there's no concern for material underneath that continues to enter Puget Sound.
So you're saying
And not
that-
only Puget Sound, but there's an irony to sort of applying a concept of water coming from above and always polluting downwards when you're talking about a place like the Port Peninsula, where the groundwater level is pretty much right at the surface to begin with. I mean, they're not really the way that the environmental laws have been written have to do with cleaning up the surface of the land. And for example, with the Children's Museum, the concept is you take the top level contaminants down to, I think it is 15 feet, right? There's kind of this enshrined notion under the regulations of 15 feet or 12 feet, I'm not sure which it is. But you clean up the surface, and then you put a cap over it, and then it'll be okay, because the rain is kept out, or because people are not exposed because stuff isn't coming up from below to expose people who are walking around the area. But when you're in a place that's right on the waterfront, and especially when you start thinking about sea level rise, that kind of model of cleanup, it's not a one-size-fits-all. What might work in, I don't know, some in Ellensburg, isn't going to work in the South Sound. You know, it's just not the same thing, and the problems aren't the same. So this problem of groundwater and where it travels is something that is not being sufficiently addressed, I would
Right.
say.
Well,
And as
one
far
of
as
the,
Moxley Creek goes, the problem is that the land that Westman Mill is building on has not really been remediated more than just a couple of surface feet.
Well, in
maybe
some
only a
areas,
foot.
it has been remediated, you know, to be really clear. There are some areas that were considered hot spots that they did dig deeper, and they removed the soil, and I believe they did some pump and treat too. I could be wrong, but
the thing about creosote, it's like coal tar, and we have another we had a source of coal tar. You remember when the city hall was built, the new city hall. The source actually was in the vicinity of that bunch of transformers on Legion. So the material, coal tar like creosote, it's heavier than water. It's called a dense non-aqueous phase liquid. So when it comes in contact with groundwater, it's going to tend to sink. And and then find that first impervious layer and then migrate horizontally with the flow of groundwater or the force of gravity or, you know, capillary action, whatever. And so it's really, you know, what we really need to do is map the nature and extent of all of these dense non-aqueous phase liquids, and you know, where did they originate? What's their pathway? And we have a hot spot right at the south end of East Bay with over 1,000 parts per trillion dioxin in the subsurface. I think it's about 270 on the surface of the benthos, the bottom, and then an adjoining hot spot on the land of I think over 500 parts per trillion. So bear in mind the model, the MOTCA cleanup number, what the state hopes for is 11 parts per trillion, so over 500 is pretty high. The threshold that the Corps of Engineers will accept for open water disposal is 3.5, so over 1,000 is insanely high. And you put these three numbers together, all in the same vicinity, we might assume that there is some kind of a source there that needs to at least be assessed. What is the nature and extent of that extremely hot spot? And you just have to go right across the road and you're at the Westman Mill development. So rather than just going around and doing a few samples, very few of which are below the surface at all. The deepest are maybe 11 feet. And then capping the site with a geotextile membrane and putting crushed rock on it, and then calling that a cleanup.
When you say geotextile membrane, that's just a sheet of plastic, right?
Yeah.
Permeable sheet of plastic.
Permeable sheet of plastic.
it looks like weed block, basically. Yeah.
Go on.
It's working at it from the development end. So rather than starting at the contamination end and trying to determine what's the source and what's the pathway, the nature and extent and so on of this hotspot, let's have everything be development based and try and assess it from that end. And it's backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a historian, I have to say it really looks super backwards because, I mean, we have to think about all the things that were there. The Olympia Veneer Company, which people in Olympia, you know, they loved having the work of all these veneer companies in town.
That's a
but they
plywood company, basically, right?
Yeah, but when you read the
Can you
papers,
point out where that was?
well, it was pretty much where they're proposing to put this building.
I see.
And it's spread out to where the Children's Museum is. And as I understand it, if you look at a picture, and maybe I can get you one, but if you look at a picture of the veneer company, one of the things that made it necessary to do the Children's Museum part of the cleanup was that, I believe, was where the fuel depot was for the factory. So you have those kinds of issues. At the time, a lot of Olympians were concerned about the glues and things that were used for these plywood factories, and there was always a lot of sort of mumbling about people just pouring the glue into the ground rather than disposing of it properly. You have just this whole history of industrial use of the area. One of the sources of toxins was that they would have those burners for what they called hog fuel. It was sort of like the waste chips or whatever.
Yeah.
That creates dioxins. You know, that is a source of pollution in itself. They were all over. You know, there were several mills dotted all over the peninsula that did that. Another thing, the municipal garbage dump was right there in that area. One of the things they found when they did the studies for this development was arsenic that they couldn't explain. So I sent an article to someone in the city saying that when they did a cleanup of the dump as part of a WPA program in the 1930s, they dumped a whole bunch of arsenic, a whole bunch of rat bait right there. Just, you know, we're talking thousands, I don't even know, you know, thousands of pounds of it. Olympia, the port area used to just have a terrible rat problem, and people put out arsenic, you know, rat poison all over the place anyway. But then there was this huge program of killing these thousands of rats with poison. Is that in the record anywhere other than, you know, happening across it in a newspaper article? No. So, you know, we have to understand the many layers of misuse of this area. And the real irony here is that the whole reason we're talking about it being a residential development is because after the veneer company closed in the 1960s, it became what's called a brownfield. You know, it's old, abandoned industrial lands. This wasn't actually abandoned. I think it was the St. Regis Paper Company found a way to convince the port that it should buy this land off of them, and then it just sat there for a long time, and they knocked a few buildings down, but they didn't bother to find out what was underneath. They didn't care.
And the Children's Museum, Hands-On Children's Museum, is in that same area. Do you think the ground under that is safe for kids to be running on?
No, it's not. No, the ground underneath the Children's Museum, it's only cleaned up to a certain depth.
What depth?
I believe
Shallow.
It's 15 feet.
I don't think it's 15.
It's not even.
They will go down that deep for elevator shafts and utility installations and so on, but other than that, it's...
Both the Children's
what?
Museum and the parking lot at the end of, if you drive out to the boat launch area, and there's that really big parking lot with that beautiful view, what that really is it's a cap of the Superfund site.
The Cascade Pole. The big picture reality of our situation in Olympia is that most every bit of the solid ground north of 4th Avenue is on fill. And the fill is dredge spoils. We're not sure exactly where all the fill that makes up the land we have now, where it came from, the source of it. But the bottom line is that virtually every bit of the land, the soil, north of 4th Avenue in Olympia is very toxic at a level like tantamount to Love Canal. We have Love Canal in our front yard, and it's truly toxic. and we go digging in it and excavating and poking into it. And the more we mess with it, the more we liberate all these pockets of toxins. We don't know what we're getting ourselves into. But all of this land is very toxic, and we should not be driving 16-inch pilings that are 100 feet long into the soil so that we can develop at sea level on toxic ground for the views.
Well, let me just say too, though, before everybody says, oh, it's a toxic stew, why even touch it? I mean, one of the things that, again, Harry can talk about is the best thing you can do to clean it up is daylight it. A lot of these contaminants have half-lives. If they're exposed, it's the old dilute, disperse kind of concept.
I've heard has a half-life of 10 years in sunlight and maybe 1,000 years in darkness.
Okay,
So,
that's pretty convincing.
yeah.
Yes. Now, a lot of people say it's just not very practical to daylight Moxlie Creek because it's 20 feet under. And a lot of people in other areas have daylighted their stream by reconstructing it on the surface. Would that be a practical way of dealing with this?
Exactly. The city claims that it would be too difficult to daylight it because it's 15 feet under. It passes under buildings and streets and utilities and so on. But really it could, from where it goes under the ground, it could follow any pathway as long as water flows downhill. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. When you look at the whole proposal, the city claims that it would be impracticable to daylight this portion of Moxlie and Indian Creek. If you go to the Woodland Trail study of Indian Creek, they found a lot of potential in there, a lot of good existing habitat, a lot of minor small culverts that could be removed and serve no purpose, a lot of improvements that could be made. And their conclusion is it's hardly worth it because the lower watershed where it runs through a pipe is in such bad shape. You can also find references in other city sources that it's not worth fixing the lower watershed because the upper watershed is in such bad shape. So it doesn't make sense to fix A without fixing B, and it doesn't make sense to fix B without fixing A, so let's just fix neither. It's kind of a
Or let's
circular,
fix both.
dark reason.
Well, yeah, we'd like to fix it all. But,
Yes,
yeah.
and I have some examples here of where they have done exactly that in other cities. These are all creeks. In some cases they're rivers, but mostly they're very small creeks that used to be in pipes and have been brought to the surface and have obviously become a real feature for the city. This is Kalamazoo, Michigan,
Isn't that lovely?
Arcadia Creek.
With the walkway.
Here's Bee Branch in Dubuque, Iowa. Here's Bee Branch before it was daylighted. Similar
like dirt
to
and
ours, doesn't it?
asphalt. Mhm.
Melbourne, Australia had this flooding problem, as you can see. A lot of that is due to what Harry was talking about, the swift current of a constricted stream, artificially constricted stream. And to deal with that, they daylighted that stream. Here's what it looks like now.
Oh, how lovely.
Now when it floods, it forms a sheet over a wide area, slow moving, and they don't have the flooding downtown.
And I bet it's full of fish and wildlife and amphibians.
Kind of looks like it, doesn't it?
You can tell.
Here's Seoul, Korea, where they've daylighted a stream.
Nothing attracts people like water?
Yeah, it's a big recreation spot. Sawmill River in Yonkers, New York.
Oh,
Bishan Park, Singapore.
Can I say that this isn't the first time that people have thought about making that part of downtown Olympia look like this. A lot of the history of Olympia has to do with dredges. You decide to dredge the channel for industry, and then you have all this dredge. So what do you do with it? Well, let's make some more land. Let's come up with a new dream. And a lot of what we've been talking about here today is these successive dredgings of the East Bay, sort of increasingly constricting the Moxlie estuary and causing the fill of Moxlie Creek and what they used to call Moxlie Slough, which is kind of the upper area. It's interesting because it used to have a value as a bottomland. Back at the turn of the 20th century, back 1900 or so, the area was farmland where they did truck gardening. There was a Chinese garden there. I think the name of the gardener was Lum Zhou, and he basically supplied the vegetables for the city. There was a celery farm. And so when they were talking about doing another fill, another channel dredge of the East Bay and using the fill again, and what are we going to do with the fill right after World War II, there was a lot of discussion in the community about recreation. Some people advocated taking Priest Point Park and putting the fill over there and putting in a swimming area. Yeah, and people were like, whoa, wait a minute. No. But there was a lot of argument. Every time you have one of these dredges come along, you get this community argument about what is this city and what are we supposed to do with it and what do we want. And for this late 1940s dredge, the Moxlie Slough area had not been fully filled in. So there was still this kind of what people called a bog or a swamp in that area where Indian Creek and Moxlie Creek kind of flowed together right there around where the city hall is now, or Union and Plum, sort of that area. And so they were having, yeah, they were having an argument about what to do about that. And there was this guy named Otis Murray, and he was the city commissioner of Public Works. And he wrote a letter to City Hall, and he said, well, let's imagine building a park there. Let's imagine a park about 3 blocks wide and about 5 blocks long, which would be centered around this area that is now more or less the old City Hall, the Justice Center now. And he said, where remnants of the old slough survive. Okay, so describing it as, to his eyes, a bog and an eyesore and all those terrible things, sort of harking back to when it was a smelly sewer and all of that. He said we could make it bloom like a rose, one of the beauty spots of the Northwest. So he said, being, he was the commissioner of Public Works, so he said, imagine if we could have something that would be really beautiful, a park, like a central park, like so many places do. He pointed out that a fair bit of the land there was still public property, and the rest would be really cheap because it was bog land. So let's buy it all and create this big kind of central park. He said it would, of course, take time to develop it, but the people of Olympia would have something fine to look forward to and to build to, something involving beautiful lawns, shrubbery, flower gardens, artificial lily ponds, lakes, splashing fountains, bird baths, playground equipment, and so on. And he said that this attraction would encourage people to build nice little homes around it, thereby, he said, keeping the city more compact rather than sprawled out towards the prairies. So he had this whole vision, and just imagine if they had taken that vision instead of just turning it into gas stations and the like.
We
And
still
imagine,
have that
imagine
vision.
if they had daylighted the creek at that point as one of the water features that people could play and splash in and all of that, because it was still clean. At this time, it was still the city water source. You know, it was clean water that we were talking about. And at that point, not only would that have created a whole different aesthetic for people to think about that part of town and give even more value to Moxlie Creek, which, you know, so many of us value it for Watershed Park. But it would also have made that culvert just that much shorter. It would have made it 5 blocks shorter. And we'd be talking about maybe only having to daylight another six or 7 blocks, I'm not sure. But, it, you know, the problem for us now would be much slighter. So,
Yeah.
you know, even back in the 1940s, people were imagining something like those pictures that you were just showing
Yeah.
of what it could look like. You know, it's never been considered inconceivable.
Yeah.
You know.
But was considered expensive, I suppose. So we are actually saying here that the permitting process that this Westman Mill is going through right now must have some kind of a flaw, because there are so many reasons why the final permit shouldn't be issued. Here's what a former city council member wrote. She was speaking only for herself, yet her words reflect the city's position very well. Quote, daylighting Moxlie Creek is merely a cosmetic issue with very low priority scientifically and financially. There are many projects that scientists have identified as much more important and productive.
We do a lot of studies to try and determine which are the most impaired water bodies. And this is all under guidelines right up to the Clean Water Act. And the idea is, when you identify an impaired water body, you then develop plans to improve it. And here in South Butt Inlet, we have the impaired water body of East Bay, impaired for low dissolved oxygen, high levels of nitrates, the presence of dioxin and PCBs. And then we have in West Bay a wildlife easement. It's the best habitat in the bay, and it was set aside as mitigation for development in East Bay. And what we're really trying to do in Olympia, what the city has said, is that there are greater opportunities in West Bay, that's good habitat, than there are in East Bay, that's bad habitat. Well, that's an exact reversal of the intent of the Clean Water Act, that you identify your most impaired waters and go after them. The city has said that's an impaired water, we're going to give up on it, basically, and put all our effort into this remediation, or whatever you'd call it, in a wildlife easement. And really, when you have a thing like the Port Lagoon, the best option is probably to leave it alone. That's why it was set aside. So, you know, how in the world we can justify doing that instead of East Bay? I don't see how that's a viable plan.
I mean, the port is developing this without any input from the public. It's publicly owned land, and there's been no public involvement in the process at all. At times there was a charade of public involvement, but they knew what they were going to do. There was no open bid process. We have documents that we've gotten from records requests that show where this was all done behind closed doors and completely without any public involvement at all. It's unfortunate, but this is our property. This belongs to the people of Thurston County. And yet, to say that from development, here it is right at sea level on toxic fill in an area that wants to be estuary.
Or
and-
wetland at the very
Or
least.
wetland, and would revert easily if allowed to do so. That's thwarted, and instead we put big rock down to enable development. And it's wrong. It's immoral.
You've packed a lot in there, Bill. There are a lot of issues that you raised there, and I think, going back to the one that you were talking about with this, part of the problem is how areas are defined under cleanup rules don't necessarily mesh with what we might call reality, shall we say? So that, for example, while it was obvious to everyone looking at it that there was some kind of a seep there because it was green during the driest parts of summer,
Water.
the official explanation for this area of green is that it was, when they were building the Children's Museum, it was a parking lot, and they put in a kind of a ditch, to catch water, and that is why it's green. It's completely absurd. It's a description that has nothing to do with objective reality. And that was clear to people, but there was never a response to that. There's
so
not
you did bring up these questions.
Yes,
Yeah.
people brought up these questions. I remember really clearly one young woman who lives downtown who came to one of the early hearings who talked about how much she enjoyed hearing the frogs chorus from that wetland and how much she enjoyed looking at it every day as she walked by. And this idea that there's a cultural value there, which is supposed to be something that the city thinks about and takes account of, it wasn't there. And similarly, if you try to say, well, yes, it's fill, and yes, the environmental laws say that if you have fill areas, that's as far back as you have to look. The reality is there's a stream running underneath there. There's a pipe that's holding the stream, but you have to acknowledge that the stream is there. They have tried very hard with this whole
denied it,
Even when
development
it was
process.
Obvious. They ignored the fact there were artesian springs there. They've ignored the fact that there's a stream running under there. They've ignored the fact that salmon swim up that stream. None of this had to fit the profile of filling out the cleanup paperwork. Wouldn't you say that's probably about right?
The thing is, the vision, the city of Olympia's vision for the waterfront is whatever you can get away with, in a nutshell. They've decided, well, we'll turn this over to the experts at the Department of Ecology, or we'll just do it by the rule, by the book, and they are the experts after all. And if you really want to look and massage the system to your advantage, you can get away with just about anything, is my experience. So we really need a vision for the waterfront. We don't need to say our vision is whatever you can get away with. You were asking about the process, and I've tried to think, of all the places where this could have been stopped. I would say beginning with the inception, what do we, the people, want our waterfront to look like? Do we want 5-story buildings, 250 feet long, that block the view from all directions? Or do we want to try and restore some semblance of nature and improve these urban ecosystems? There's a big movement nationally, globally, to improve urban ecosystems, and especially urban estuaries, because the estuaries have been so heavily developed, and we're now recognizing how important they are. And we're learning more and more all the time about how to do this, how to actually restore ecological function in urban estuaries. And Olympia is absolutely oblivious to all of that thinking. it's extremely frustrating, the process from the very beginning. And I can just think of one example that comes to mind was the Design Review Board. This would have been an opportunity to address these issues that are not covered by code. That's according to their own description. They basically held a meeting. No one was allowed to speak or ask questions. We were allowed to sit and listen quietly. And we were told basically that they don't address anything but things in code. Completely had their own mission backwards. And yet we, the citizens who had to sit and listen to this, were not allowed to say so.
And not only that, but you may remember, Harry, that the chair of the Design Review Board said that daylighting Moxlie Creek is a pipe dream.
Well, that was a little joke.
Yeah.
I don't mind a little joke, but the process was not properly done. And this has been, you know, as bad as the process is, if you're not even going to follow it, we as activists have just felt ignored, silenced, marginalized, every way in the world to keep us from having any input in any of this.
We have been. We've not just felt that way, we have actually been completely ignored. It's farce. Public involvement is just token, and
It's engagement theater, I've heard the term.
I think that's a good term, because they let you speak for your 3 minutes sometimes, but will they ever listen and act in ways that the citizens ask them to act? Nope, it's not on their agenda.
You can submit comments on agreed orders, and I just had a notice, this was from the state actually, an opportunity to submit comments on something. And I wrote a response and said, has the state ever changed any decision based on any public comment? And if not, why would I waste my time? And a lot of people have gotten to this point. It's just, it's a complete waste of time, this process. I hope that we're still a nation of laws, and when things, you know, when this whole process comes grinding to an end where we are now, we have a SEPA determination of non-significance. That this building, built as it is, where it is non-significant. We have an opportunity to appeal that before the hearing examiner, which is sort of a quasi-legal process. If the hearing examiner sides with the developer, you know, we're asking for an environmental impact statement, that's all. We asked the city for a feasibility study and never even got a response. Anyway, we would like an environmental impact statement, and I imagine this will go before the hearing examiner. If the hearing examiner says, no, we don't think that's required, then there are other courts of appeal, and we have to decide, we as citizens, you know, how far do we want to take this, and what can we possibly do to stop it at this point?
How much will it cost us? Because here it is, our property, and we're asking them to do the right thing for our environment.
It costs $1,000 to appeal it. You have to give that money to the city.
Okay, I think we're out of time. I feel as if we've only scratched the surface here, and there's a lot of issues, and I would encourage people to keep up with this issue as it goes along. So thank you very much for being here, Harry and Helen and Bev. And I want to thank the audience for being with us today.
Thank you for having us,
And thank you,
Janet.
Janet.